Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Transportation podcast hosted by Morpheus Meets. Today, I've had the pleasure of meeting with Alex Metz over at Apricum Consultancy. How are you, Alex?
I'm good. Thank you, Sam. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. And I think before this call, we had some bit of a technical difficulty. So I think we're sort of trying to cram a few bits in today. But I think, Alex, you've got a really nice insight to sort of the charging infrastructure, both in sort of the US and Europe as well. I mean, currently based in Paris and building out sort of the e-mobility arm for Apricum there as well, which we can certainly dive into in a bit. But I think really nice insight as to sort of the comparisons between the two. So, yeah, I mean, do you want to just tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about sort of what you're up to now, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. So maybe rewinding back a few years, grew up in France, but then started working in London for a few years, and then moved over to the US, where I spent 5 years up until last summer, and moved back to France last summer. So I think, as you said, I got the opportunity to get to know much better the North American market, especially in the energy space and within energy in the e-mobility space, and that's been a revelation and a shock in a way how different it is in Europe versus North America. I think I candidly thought that both are fairly developed, mature markets, so they should look fairly similar. We've got electricity, you've got transportation fairly developed in both, but the reality is it's really different dynamics, and I would say level of maturity are fairly different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously, I think you touched upon they're both sort of mature markets, but I mean, in terms of sort of technology, I think the US is slightly behind. But then do you think is that due to sort of the size, the scale, or even sort of the culture of automobiles over in that sort of market?
Yeah, so maybe taking a look at the actually thinking in terms of numbers. How many electric vehicles do we have today on the roads in the US versus Europe? It's roughly the same. It's roughly 3 million-ish electric vehicles. However, when you look at the number of EV chargers in both locations, you have essentially a ratio of 3 or 4. You have let's call it 150,000 chargers in the US, and you have nearly 500,000 chargers in Europe. So what it means is that if you look at the ratio between the number of vehicles per charger, so in other words, how many vehicles does one charger serve, you have something that is over 20 vehicles served by one charger in the US and less than 10 vehicles served by one charger in Europe. So that's a pretty different user experience, right? If you think about as you're driving down the road, you have essentially a chance that is 2, maybe 3 times higher to get to find an available charger in Europe, at least on paper, than in the US. And surprisingly, I don't think that's very intuitive. I think people would have guessed maybe the opposite, because we can get into that in a minute. But the actual user experience is, I find it worse in Europe than in the US.
And why is that?
So I think there's a couple of reasons. If we look at the US, the electricity market is mostly regulated at the state level. So essentially you have 50 different markets, if you will, for electricity. However, for transportation, it's mostly at the federal level. You have a US highway system. You have consistent signage as you drive from one state to the next. Everything, is fairly consistent. So what it means is that it's been historically fairly easy for charge point operators to expand from, let's say, California to Oregon or Washington State. So, go along the West Coast. And so as a result, if you look at the market today, the top 5 charging port operators have over 80% market share. So it's a fairly concentrated market. And the charging user experience is, I would say, becoming even more consistent with a number of federal level regulations. You've heard about the bipartisan infrastructure law from 2021. It's carved out, I know, over $7.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure. We've all heard about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act from last year. That's another, 1,500 tax credits for EVs, 30% tax credits for EV chargers. And I think something that the US has been pretty smart about, and specifically the administration, is to create what they call a joint office for energy and transportation, which essentially both departments join together into an office that is setting rules and standards. And so you have things that have been communicated over the last few months, such as the requirements to have EV charging stations less than 50 miles apart from each other. And with a minimum level of 150 kW power level. So you have really a push towards a better user experience. Things like single payment methods versus in Europe, you typically have to use CPO specific apps and accounts, and it always takes ages to sign up to the new one, and it never works, and so on. So just a few examples of how I've seen in the US. And it's, again, pretty surprising and unintuitive, more consistency than what I'm seeing in Europe.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, we touched upon in a couple of previous conversations as well, is the amount of charge point operators, CPOs in Europe as well, which obviously I think you touched upon that in America there isn't as many. You've got sort of the key players in that market, which, I mean, I'm assuming that would affect the user experience as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. I think if you look at the, let's say the top 3 CPOs in the UK, they are completely different from the top 3 CPOs in France, who are completely different from the top CPOs in Germany. And, you may expect these are fairly, these are neighboring countries, similar electricity markets, similar transportation regulations. But the reality is it's way less consistent. And the CPO market in Europe is highly fragmented, as you said. We recently published an article on the topic. I think between last time we spoke and when we're talking now, it's been officially published, so we can now put a link in the show notes. But in Germany only, we were looking at the CPO market, and we can count over 100 different CPOs that operate at least 100 different chargers each. So it just gives you a sense of how fragmented this market is, and especially in these large countries in Western Europe, where you start to have a significant EV penetration. That starts to become a real risk against accelerated market adoption, right? And I think if you compare this to more mature countries, I was catching up with someone who's operating a CPO in Norway recently, and I think Norway is probably the world's leading country in EV penetration. They have something like 80% of sales are electric vehicles. To a point where it was very funny. This guy was telling me that to get in the local media, you have to actually be buying a internal combustion engine vehicle. Like that's the exotic thing, is the one person who's still buying an internal combustion engine vehicle. And he was showing a 2-pager on a major media that explains why this person can't buy an EV and the reasons why. And I think it just tells how much mindset shift there can be in countries like that. But anyway, so in Norway, you have a much more consolidated market. And then maybe there's a future for the other countries in Europe. For instance, Recharge, which is one of the major players there, has around 20% market share in the public fast charging space. And so when you start having major players like this that own, a significant part of the market, you can expect, but the experience is much more consistent. You have a few brands to know. You are familiar with the setup of these charging stations. If you want to sign up for these specific apps, you can, because there's not 20 or 30 different ones you need to sign up with. And so that's where I can expect, hopefully, other countries in Europe get to, is the market consolidating as it matures in the future.
Yeah, and I think again we touched upon sort of geography as well, and I think this is where maybe the US will, I wouldn't necessarily struggle, but take a little bit more time perhaps to sort of get to the same level as the Nordic countries, as you said. I think the Nordics benefit from having a high population density, so obviously they can localize their sort of charging points with sort of major cities and towns, whereas I think, again, like I said, we touched upon it in the US. It's so vast. It's and obviously I think the EV range at the moment of technology is such that ranges aren't on the same level as sort of internal combustion engines. So the charge points at the moment may have to be quite close together, but obviously in a few years they may be redundant as they're being sort of placed a little bit further apart. But what are your thoughts on sort of that sort of geographical conversation?
Yeah, it is a very valid point, but I think it's getting less and less of an issue. I think with rules like the one I was mentioning earlier about EV charging stations being less than 50 miles apart from each other in the US for what they call these alternative fuels corridors. So essentially, most of the major highways across the US will need to have these charging stations that are close enough to each other. And it's upon each state to deploy that infrastructure. I would expect that this will be solving really the key thing today, which is range anxiety. Because as you look at the pros and cons of an EV versus an internal combustion engine vehicle, in the past it was okay, an EV is more expensive than a conventional vehicle. Today it's not true anymore. In France, you can get a Tesla Model Y for 40,000 euros, and the equivalent Peugeot 5008, which is the similar sized, fairly big SUV kind of model, same price. And the difference is in OPEX, where on the one hand you're going to pay upwards of 50 euros per tank refuel versus 10, 15 euros each time you charge up at a charging station. Obviously, you don't get as much range, but still the ratio is 1 to 3, 1 to 4 in terms of the relative cost. And I'm not even talking about maintenance costs, which are much cheaper for an EV. You don't have anything to change beyond tires, essentially. So I think back to your point, it is true that the last bit we need to solve is the range anxiety issue. I have seen a significant amount of deployments, both in the US with the BIL and especially the BIL funding, and in Europe with the amount of funding that got into these CPOs the past few years, and it's something we've also looked at in the article we published. There has been a wave of deployment in the past year, 2022, and the first quarters of 2023, that is really significant. The last weekend we were driving down to the south of France, and the number of charging stations where, if you look at the reviews, you can tell that it was open in November last year. And they are really well located. These are, 15, 20, 25 chargers in a location that is, has the right amenities, is close to a, park or something where you can enjoy the time while your cars are charging, which, takes 20, 30 minutes. There has been, I think, a significant change between now and even 2 years ago. I think 2 years ago, you were doing a road trip across France or across any country. You had to plan, and you had to be careful about how far you can go and making sure you have enough charge and so on. Today, I think you can just drive, and you can rely on your in-vehicle road mapper, and it's going to work out. If a station is full, you can go to the next one. There starts to be enough of them, and I think that ties back to my point earlier about the ratio of number of chargers per vehicle is high enough. Like there's enough chargers today. This may change, right? Because it's essentially a chicken and egg situation where you may deploy charging infrastructure too fast, which means you won't recoup your investment. But on the other hand, it means a great, easier experience for you and I as EV drivers, right? And so I can expect that there's going to be a wave of much more EVs sold in the next few months, which means there's going to be a feeling that there's not enough chargers, and then hopefully we'll have more chargers deployed in the next few quarters to catch up. So I think it's going to be a catch up game between EVs and EV chargers in the next few years.
Absolutely, and I think obviously on your point of relying on your car to travel, I think that is that works for sort of maybe domestic markets as well. But I think again we spoke around sort of international, like European travel as well, going from sort of country to country. There are sort of different regulations, different points. You touched actually, I think France has some very quirky charge point regulations as well, which is different to the rest of EU.
Yeah, that's a funny story that I heard from someone who's running a CPO down in the south of France. And I was even shocked to learn that, to be honest. So there's different charger hardware standards across EU countries, and I think in France, there's the funniest one is probably this one. So all AC, as far as I understand, all AC chargers are required to have a regular domestic socket. The one that you would plug your smartphone in to charge, in addition to the regular CCS port, which is the one that you typically use for AC charging for a vehicle. And what I learned is that this rule dates back to 2017, when at the time then Minister Ségolène Royal added this clause to the rules so that the cars that were manufactured by a company called MIA, which was a local manufacturer that was located in her voting base in France, so that these cars could charge, because these cars didn't support any other charging standard. They were very small, compact cars that didn't require much power to get charged up. So a regular socket was fine. And also, I guess, and at the time, they thought it's easier to see if you can charge on your regular socket, and you don't have to wait for too long. So there's an obvious, political drive behind that. And I think the saddest thing is that this car manufacturer had gone bankrupt since then. But the rule still exists, and so what it means is that EV manufacturers that are that are trying to sell chargers into France, and CPOs that want to operate and expand into France, they have a harder time to comply with the French market, right? Because they have to adjust their product so it fits this very quirky French regulation, which, to be honest, has no real use case today. Like no one, I don't think, would, or very, very few people rather, would go on a street to charge into a power socket, which is 1-2 kilowatt, versus using the AC CCS socket, which is gives you 7, 11, or even more kilowatt. There's no real reason for doing that unless you want to stay in your car for another 24 hours. So it's just an example, and I'm sure there's many others, but it's just an example of how we have ways to go in making standards more consistent across the different EU countries, such that we can have a more a better experience for users and for CPOs that are trying to expand. You can imagine a German-based CPO trying to move into France and discovering this, as they're trying to do the engineering design, the permitting on their stations. That's not something you want to realize at that point, but there's nothing you can go around it. Like I don't think there's any plan to change that rule today, and I think the political will is focused on many other things beyond this very specific clause that is annoying this very small part of the market.
effectively what they've done is put in a very expensive phone charging network. It's,
Yeah.
in um, so I guess just to sort of I guess just to sort of wrap us up today, Alex. I mean, in terms of sort of as in your sort of consulting, I guess perspective, you've got a bit of a bird's eye view of not just the European market, but you've got that sort of benchmark with the US as well, and you can sort of take the pros and cons from both. Now, having spoken to a couple of people in sort of the European market as well, the general consensus is that these sort of big oil companies will come in, buy up the market share, and effectively in a few years will be whittled down to a handful of CPOs. In your perspective, is that sort of something that is likely, or is there sort of alternate outcomes? What's sort of the next 5-10 year vision, I guess, or theory?
Yeah, it is a great question, and something we've put some thought into the article I was referring to earlier, and we've actually had conversations with a number of folks who've read the article and had the same question. So the current view is there will be a consolidation. You need to have bigger players to so that the CPOs are not price takers, but are price makers, and they have more control on the rates they can charge that are more dynamic based on traffic and expected utilization. And so what it means for the types of players we see as being the winners or the key players. So oil and gas players are obvious ones in the sense that they are traditionally operating these fuel stations, and electricity is just another fuel, right? You used to have gasoline, then diesel, then some other very specific fuels that are sometimes used in countries like France. And now you just add electricity to the mix, and that's just another commodity that you offer to your drivers. And I think there's going to be a few decades where we need both, and people would love to see a fully electric world tomorrow, but it's not going to be the case. There's going to be all these vehicles that are still on the road that still will be needed for specific use cases. Some people will not be willing to switch to electric today, and same for companies, by the way. So there's going to be a time where these oil and gas players will be relevant on both sides, and I think it's good. It's important that they remain relevant for electric as well as fossil fuel refueling. So that's one type. Another obvious type is electric utilities or energy companies. We're seeing in France, EasyVia, which is EDF's EV CPO business, being one of the key players, and similarly in Germany you have EnBW. You have a bunch of other traditional electric utilities or energy companies. Enel is another one in Italy that are deploying their CPO business, and again that makes a lot of sense. They know what electricity is. It's just another endpoint in the grid they operate, or the end part of the value chain they are used to operating. So that's an obvious one. Another category is pure players. We like to see traditional segments take a new market, but there are today a bunch of pure players that are fairly big in that space. To name a few, you have players like Fastnet, you have Electra, you have Allego. These ones are players that are purely CPO businesses, were established solely for this, and have been already doing a pretty good job at covering a number of different countries in Western Europe specifically. Then you have, another obvious one is automakers that will want to own this part of the client relationship. Traditionally, automakers, you would have a contact with them, if any, when you buy a vehicle, and then that's it. Or maybe when you service it, if you service at an automaker branded service station. But but tomorrow, and Tesla is the most obvious example, but you will still think about the brand of your car as you charge. So you charge at Tesla superchargers for Teslas and now for non-Teslas as well. But you have other examples of essentially CPOs that are consortium of automakers that are trying to deploy charging stations together. Both on the passenger car and the electric truck side of things, by the way. Milence is an example, which is deploying heavy-duty truck EV charging infrastructure. And it's a consortium of the top, I think, 3 or 4 major truck manufacturers in Europe. So that's another category. And then there may be other ones. There may be, for instance, REITs, real estate investment trusts, that are seeing this as a way to value or increase the value of their real estate and their properties, and whether they are operating, large malls, grocery store chains. We are seeing a number of these players deploy charging infrastructure, and they actually either do it themselves or they outsource it to CPOs that are doing it on their behalf. And then finally, and that's probably going to be my the last category I can think of, you have infrastructure funds. And I think these ones shouldn't be forgotten, because it is a major shift that the same way as solar and wind farms have become a new real asset class for infrastructure funds, now I'm hearing more and more infra funds talking about EV charging infrastructure as a new asset class. And it's, if you look at it, it makes sense. In a mature market, it's a very asset-heavy, very hardware-heavy asset, and its economics are based on some sort of fairly easy, in the future at least, to forecast utilization. It's, for how long will this charger be on the ground until it needs to be replaced, and how many times per day is it expected to be used for charging, and therefore what does my revenue stream look like? And it requires a significant amount of investment, and so it makes sense that infra funds are looking at this and say, I want to deploy 100 million, I want to deploy €500 million, pounds, you name it, into that asset class, working with a CPO, helping them deploy their EV charging infrastructure, the same way as you are seeing infra funds or pension funds saying, I want to be working with this solar developer and finance their projects through an SPV kind of contracts. It makes natural sense, and we are still very early stage in that evolution, but I wouldn't be surprised that in the next few years we see more and more infra funds playing a key role, either actively or passively through investing into these players.
Really interesting insight, and potentially another episode incoming around that as well. But we'll wrap up there, Alex. But I just want to say thank you very much for your time today. Lovely to see you again, and we'll have you back on the podcast soon.
Likewise, thank you, Sam. Have a good day.